Welcome to the RE Human Layer Security Podcast, the show that flips the script on cybersecurity. I'm Tim Sadler, the CEO and co-founder of Tessian, and in each episode, I'll be interviewing IT and business leaders about why we need to protect people, not just machines and data, to stop breaches and empower businesses to achieve their missions. Hi everyone, hope you're all having a great week. On the show today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Josh Yavor, Tessian's Chief Information Security Officer. Prior to joining Tessian earlier this year, Josh has held senior security roles, including the head of corporate security at Facebook, the head of cloud security at Duo Security, and he was also the Chief Information Security Officer at Cisco Secure. He's here to talk about some of the biggest trends in spear phishing and social engineering, and we couldn't be more excited to have him on the podcast today. Welcome to the podcast, Josh.
Thanks, Tim. I'm really excited to be here.
So, Josh, you're a couple of months into being Tessian's first ever Chief Information Security Officer. How's it going?
It's quite busy and exciting at the same time. So it's been delightful to come into Tessian, meet everyone here, and join a combination of both a highly effective security product organization that's supporting a really effective and compelling security product itself.
Could you maybe tell us a bit about your career so far? You know, you've worked at some amazing organizations and actually in quite a variety of different security positions.
Yeah, so in my background, I think I've had a pretty exciting journey throughout my security career. I actually started as a middle school teacher, though, and I start there in my career description because to date, it was the hardest job I've ever had and probably will remain so. But it's also the job through which I learned the most in terms of leadership management and also developing empathy for those who we serve. And that ended up being incredibly valuable as I moved into security and product organizations, especially those that have broader customer bases, especially the Ciscos, the Facebooks, and now here at Tessian. I think that background and that journey has really helped me identify the ways in which security programs really need to empower trustworthy outcomes for the customers and consumers of the products and services that we're providing.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing story. And I definitely see that in the work that you're doing with the team. You recently published a report with your team, and you found that over 2 million potentially malicious emails bypassed existing email security defenses. Now, I know we're diving straight in here, but email security, social engineering, and phishing is something that's pretty close to your heart. Why is that?
Yeah, it's close to my heart because the human factor, right? Humans either making a mistake or being compelled into making a mistake and tricked by others is the classic source of most of our problems in security today. And as we know well from all of the research leading up to this year of the past decade plus, we know that consistently the vast majority of security events and ultimately larger breaches start with human interaction in communication systems, namely email. And so the risks inherent in traditional email phishing and more advanced social engineering attacks using email, such as business email compromise and some of the additional ways that attackers are now pivoting towards account takeover, that's always top of mind because it's quite literally for attackers, to date, the entry point into almost all organizations for achieving malicious outcomes.
And has it always been that way? How have you seen this trend evolve in terms of, targeting humans as the entry point to an organization?
I think it's a tale as old as time. Even before we had digital systems for communication, and you go back to the classic days of espionage practices and so on, human compromise and human operations between adversaries have always been a highly effective method for achieving attacker goals. I say attacker, and I paused there because one person's attacker is another side's hero, right? Especially in classic espionage. But if we fast forward into the digital area, email is one of our oldest protocols and mechanisms for communication, and I think it's to be expected that with that comes a long history of attack and abuse cases that have developed and evolved with early email, all the way up to contemporary use cases for email in an ever more hybrid and global workforce and society.
And one of the things the report highlighted is just the fact that a lot of these, these social engineering attacks or these malicious emails are coming through, and they're bypassing some of the baked-in defenses that we might see in Office 365 or Google Workspace. Why is that happening? Why are these attacks getting through? Why are the traditional ways of filtering emails and filtering spam not actually fit to solve this problem?
Right. I think it's because of the diversity of the types of attacks that can be brought against individual humans and organizations of people. And so, the traditional approaches that may have addressed perhaps the majority of early email threats back when phishing was perhaps simpler and more predictable, and the early days of spam taught us a lot about rules-based methodology for email filtering and flagging and that type of thing. But as our technology has evolved and those initial approaches of applying rules to actually filter and identify for malicious encounters in email, attackers have changed behavior as well. And so, we're seeing more advanced evolutions in technology and practices for email-based compromise and social engineering. So, what used to start with a prototypical phishing email with poorly crafted language and sketchy URLs embedded in it, or really odd looking attachments that were more easy for humans and rule-based systems to identify, these have evolved into multi-touch interactions over email where attacker behavior is more reflective of normal human behavior. And that means that you need a behavioral based approach to actually identify these types of more advanced encounters with adversaries via email.
Yeah, I guess this point about impersonation and social engineering, the traditional approach was kind of like a threat intelligence approach. You would add things to a known bad list, and you just look up the sender or look up the content against that. And now this concept of impersonation is playing a bigger role. So actually trying to simulate or impersonate the identity of a trusted person within somebody's network to try and get into the organization. And in your opinion, is this kind of one of the biggest shifts? This is the backbone, I guess, of business email compromise.
Yeah, I think impersonation is an area where we are seeing shift. Impersonation has been around for quite a while, right? And I think that the most simplistic version of impersonation is the all too common, free email provider account. The Gmails, the Yahoos, the AOLs, and so on, where there is replacement, Tim, actually of your name, right? So it's one of the things that we see as Tessian. We see plenty of emails from free email service providers that are people claiming to be you, and these are the easiest impersonation examples to identify as humans and catch. But there are more sophisticated impersonation behaviors that have evolved and that we need to be concerned about. We need to be thinking about the role of impersonation in less obvious situations, where it may be something that starts as an interaction in social media, on something like LinkedIn or over a Signal conversation for secure messaging, that then evolves into a email that has leveraged a trust anchor, so to speak, that was established in another medium. And again, that's where a traditional approach of relying on humans to be able to identify reliably that is malicious impersonation and not actually the person that they think it is, that starts to fall flat, and we have to look at new approaches and solutions for identifying those impersonation risks.
Yeah, and one of those things that your report highlights is 2%, I think, of the malicious emails that your team looked into were examples of account takeover. And maybe tell us a bit more about account takeover and why this is something that maybe most organizations aren't actually thinking about when it comes to phishing.
Yeah, fundamentally, account takeover is something that organizations are used to, but in a different context, right? So for years now, we've been focused on password hygiene and the use of unique and strong passwords across all of the sites that we use. password managers evolved as a solution that we could use. And the application of various forms of multi-factor authentication have emerged as well to address the most classic account takeover risks. But when you think about account takeovers in the context of email, things change a bit. Because as an organization, we need to be worried about two different things. One is account takeover that leads to compromise of our own inboxes as an organization, and how that can actually be leveraged by an attacker to cause harm internally and externally through the legitimate use of a legitimate email address that was compromised by an attacker for illegitimate outcomes. And then finally, those accounts, that type of account takeover can also impact us when we're working with our partners and third parties. One of the most insidious risks today is how to actually deal with account takeover, not in our own organizations, but in that of our trusted partners and even our customers. How do we prepare ourselves and defend against inbound emails that are actually from legitimate organizations that we trust, from humans that we know, yet the actual human on the other end is now an adversary, and we don't necessarily know that as humans most immediately?
Yeah, I was on a panel this week, and one of the topics was talking about just the rise of impersonation in the form of deepfakes as well. And the fact that because so much more of our lives are becoming digital, that this concept of having to trust or put a faith in digital communication, it's an increasingly complex field. You know, you can generally trust 99.99% of the messages and people that you're in communication with, but it only takes one adversary or one event to cause real harm. I mean, where do we go with this, Josh? This is obviously, it's a tough situation. It's a tough topic, but it's real. What is your advice as we start to think about how do we trust the digital world and our communication with others, whether it's on email, whether it's on social media, whether it's, trusting the information that we're viewing through YouTube video?
Absolutely. I think I have perhaps a two-pronged approach and a stream of thinking here. And the first starts with humans, of course. And we need to do a couple things there. One is that we need to sufficiently empower and entrust. And I use that word mindfully and intentionally, because inevitably we must be able to trust that the organizations and the people in the organizations that we support know what they're doing in terms of the business interactions that they're undertaking. And we need to be there as security programs and as technology providers for security to empower those to be trustworthy actions. So that looks like effective security culture development within an organization. It means rethinking how we've done classical anti-phishing, anti-social engineering training, moving away from punitive consequences for clicking on a link that still ended up in your inbox, and moving more towards enablement of critical thinking and support for the humans who are quite literally on the front lines of defense for many social engineering attacks. I like to refer to it as applying both types of AI, right? We're most commonly used to hearing AI mean artificial intelligence. I like thinking about AI also as actual intelligence and the humans that are on those front lines for us. And then that second prong is on the technology side. We were talking a few minutes ago about how traditional rules-based approaches, had their heyday, but that heyday is behind us because attacker behaviors have evolved, and we need to be able to keep up. And so, from a technology perspective, that is where we're looking at, human behavior analysis and the application of the other side of AI and machine learning, of course, to look at tooling and solutions that empowers us to proactively have a chance of defending against the evolution and the unpredictable evolution of attacker behavior in communication systems like email.
I wanted to go back to your point on security training. This is training and awareness is something that we often talk about on this podcast with our guests. I would say that training and awareness is part of every security program in every organization around the world. But when you're talking about things like account takeover, for example, where actually there's no discernible pattern that you can train a human to look for in the email because it's actually come from a legitimate email account, but it's an illegitimate sender. Where are we in terms of the overall, I guess, our progress as organizations in thinking about security training? It seems like it is something we have to have in place. Education is the first step towards building a secure workforce and an empowered workforce. But where does it have to go next? What do we need to be thinking about as we get our people ready for some of these new threats that we're seeing?
I think we've started to do some of the right things. And in thinking about classic security training areas of focus, especially for the example that you mentioned, Tim, of account takeover and malicious inbound emails. If you look back and think about some of the guidance that has traditionally been given to employees on this front, we give them a typically rather long list of responsibilities on the employee side to say, you need to know how a URL is constructed and know how to evaluate the trustworthiness of a domain, whether or not a subdomain has been entered, and how to think about a path that may actually hide an ultimate, top-level domain that is hidden from view. Incredibly complicated. We've tried to train employees and make them responsible for thinking about whether or not an attachment is sufficiently trustworthy or not, when that's incredibly difficult for any human to do. But what we have done already that I think is worth carrying forward and really empowering humans to do is simplifying that list of requirements down to the ones that are based on behaviors. Just as we're looking to advancements in tooling on human behavior analysis and security outcomes that tooling can provide, we can provide the same type of training and reinforcement for our humans. Specifically, if I think about that situation of a account takeover situation with a otherwise trusted third party, one of the most compelling training experiences that we can provide for potential victims of those types of attacks is to empower them and coach them to think about behavioral analysis. So if I am receiving an email from somebody who is at a trusted party, I know this person, maybe not personally in a physical context of having met them in person before, but I know them digitally through our interactions over email to date. If all of a sudden I'm getting an email from them that has a sense of urgency behind it that is unexpected and out of the blue and does not match the otherwise established relationship that we have, that's a potential indicator of potential badness, right? And then if there's a call to action in that request or a subsequent request in conversation with that attacker, that's another behavioral change. If this is a person who in their function and role would never ask me to download an attachment that is software, perhaps that is something that's much easier for a human in our organization to detect, rather than asking them to understand the difference between a PDF file and a .bat file and so on. I think it's easier for us to coach on that behavioral component. And finally, it all comes down to human behaviors within an organization as well. So the most effective security training that is out there today starts with security programs that are there and showing up and highly present for their organization, where reaching out to security for assistance is something that is organic to the organization and not something where an employee is fearful of a adversarial relationship or a situation where they might get in trouble or be blamed or shamed for needing help on this front, or for potentially have gotten into a sticky situation.
Let's talk more about that a little bit. What is your philosophy as a CISO and as a security leader when it comes to empowering, the employees that essentially rely on your team every single day to be secure?
Yeah, I think that for a modern and progressive and effective security organization, it starts with recognizing that the role of security in the day-to-day life of the employees in the organization that they support is actively in support of the outcomes of that organization. We've historically seen and sadly continue to see in some cases adversarial relationships in terms of security teams being that classic team that says, no to everything, or they're the reason why we can't achieve objectives A, B, or C, because there is there's a lack of understanding as it's perceived of the security organization to sufficiently meet the needs of the employees and teams that they're supporting. We really, thankfully, we've come a long way as an industry, but really recognizing security programs as business and human enablement functions, similar to how we think about IT, right? IT is all about making sure that an organization has the tools and the capabilities to actually do business effectively and efficiently. Security needs to be doing the same. Obviously, we have a risk management component that comes in there, and we need to add on a few words here. We need to be able to empower the organization to achieve their goals in a safe and trustworthy manner. You'll notice I didn't say security there, because there's far more than just security that goes into being a safe and trustworthy organization. It's one component of a broader story. And I think that the more that security programs realize that they are one of several inputs into that broader story, and look at this through the lens of empowerment as a service-oriented organization, that's one of those foundational keys to success as they start building out a program.
And what are some of those other factors other than security in your mind?
Yeah, so I think privacy comes to mind. Privacy is the shared space, right? Often, especially in a product organization like Tessian, where we have various aspects of privacy to think about. We have the privacy of our customers, which we care about. Ultimately, it's a characteristic that's paramount to our success as a provider of security services to our customer base. But we also have to support the privacy of our employees, as all organizations do. And one of the things I like to identify with folks when I'm talking about how privacy and security intersect in terms of this trust outcome is that you can absolutely have security without privacy. It's actually too easy almost to have security without privacy, but you can't actually have the inverse. You can't actually have effective privacy without security. And in a world where you only have one or the other, but not both in a converged sense, you can never achieve trust. And so, fundamentally, we need to be thinking about trust outcomes in a intersectional manner. So where does security and privacy intersect and overlap? How do we make sure that our security solutions are privacy preserving and privacy enabling? Again, it's far too easy to forget that part. And how do we ensure that the privacy outcomes that we are pursuing are actually backed by sound security fundamentals and primitives?
And on that point about privacy, sometimes we see a delineation between security and, a compliance team or a privacy team. What do you predict for the future and how these different sides of the organization are going to work together to achieve their outcomes, these shared objectives you talk about?
I think the shared component is critical there, right? Ultimately, I think that the future that I get most excited about from a organizational alignment and ownership perspective is one where every team and every function in an organization knows how they fit directly and indirectly into that broader trust story. And that trust may be a story for their employees, for their investors, for their customers, or all three. But really, it's not so much a question of, is it owned by a chief information security officer or a chief information officer or the general counsel. I think it's more of, how does an organization across all of these distributed roles and functions recognize that these are ultimately shared objectives that everyone has some stake in? And I think effectiveness of achieving those goals for an organization really depends on how well that organization cascades that realization across the teams and has that influence the way that they plan, execute, and then hold themselves accountable for their business outcomes.
And something I've often thought about is, you talk a lot about empowering the organization and security being, an enabler. Do security teams in general, are they measuring the business outcomes for the company and how security is contributing to that at the moment? Or are the KPIs and the metrics that are being measured, they're too focused on the security angle? I guess what I'm trying to say is that we use a lot of great technology as organizations. It helps us go faster. It helps us do more, but it also introduces security considerations. Sometimes you might have a CIO who is saying, hey, we're going to implement this new messaging platform because it will help us communicate with our customers better, which will be great for business, or great for our revenue. And then you have a security team that might say, well, actually, it introduces a risk, and we need to be cognizant of that. Is the answer to this, and I guess the future, is it security teams also measuring outcomes like a CIO may measure in terms of, whether it's revenue, whether it's efficiency, whether it's employee NPS? And are security teams doing this today?
Great question. I would say fundamentally, we need to continue the shift that you're mentioning here. There are some, if not many, security programs that are already well on their way in the right direction. And even some of them have years of experience behind them in achieving some of those goals that you mentioned. I am actually aware of security teams that, including one of my own previously, who actually did do a few things in terms of internal and external customer satisfaction. A classic example, of course, is help desk tickets, right? Where you may have a follow-up email that says, hey, rate your support. And that can feed into NPS scores for customers or for employees. But that idea is something that can be extended as well. And so, yes, I think in terms of how we align security objectives and outcomes with those needs of the business, I think that's fundamentally the question. And then the metrics and measurements of success, thankfully, actually come along with that. Not for free, but they're more organic than I think a lot of traditional security mindsets would account for. So a couple examples here. I think that first and most critically, an effective security program is a core partner that is actually along for the full ride. Now, there's a lot of security programs that will sit back and say, oh, well, I wasn't asked to be involved. And that's not a good enough excuse anymore. An effective security program will proactively partner with the CIO's organization, with the product organization, with the customer service organizations that they support, understand their roadmaps, and actually get ahead of some of those needs and outcomes, rather than being the teams that say, no, we can't do that in a last-minute fashion, disrupting goals, outcomes, and timelines. We need to actually pre-position ourselves as early partners to be able to say, oh, cool, yes, we can do this, and here's what we need to do to deliver this outcome in a safe and trustworthy manner. And being a trusted advisor that actually guides the business outcomes. And getting to the measurement component, one of the most effective approaches here, especially in a product organization that I have found, is to ensure that the security team is not hogging all the cookies, or basically not sharing the responsibility, and really actually seeking to look for shared ownership of these trust and safety outcomes, where I would look to partnerships with product managers and aligning on things like co-definition of what a successful, trustworthy, and safe outcome looks like for that new major product that we're launching in 18 months, or that major feature that we're iterating on this quarter. And by doing that, security teams are, giving up some level of control that may otherwise have been historically something that they pursued. But in doing so, and providing both empowerment, but also accountability and responsibility in the shared goal, it's easier to actually tie those outcomes into the actual product success measurements going into either a new launch or the ongoing support of an existing product.
And I know we've spoken about this, Josh, but for the CEOs who are listening to this podcast, or for the business leaders who are listening, a lot of what you're talking about it's about the security culture of the organization, and it has to come from the top in terms of empowering the security teams to go out and do this work with the organization. Could you tell us a bit more about your viewpoint on this? What does it take for a company and its leadership in terms of actually empowering the security team to go and then empower the workforce?
Yeah, for CEOs in particular, I think, and also obviously for the leadership team, but I think every CEO needs to have an answer to the question of, what does it mean for an employee, for an investor, and for a partner, and for customers to have a trustworthy experience with the organization that they are ultimately responsible for. And from there, the answer to that question should drive leadership outcomes and goals across an executive team that includes a broader audience, including the security program. And so ultimately seeing security functions and the leadership and the teams within their organization that support those as part of this more comprehensive and conjoined story around trustworthy outcomes, I think that's the most effective starting point. Because if we start thinking about security as a core contributor and enabler of those trust-based outcomes and goals, that helps us ensure that from a leadership perspective, that all of the right teams and functions are engaged as frequently and effectively as possible. And it helps us avoid those classic pitfalls of looking at something like a security organization as a necessary burden and cost center, to kind of use a classic descriptor, that introduces risk and change and disruption in the rest of the business that you're trying to undertake. And again, ultimately tying this into what does trust mean for that organization and letting that lead the way. I think that's the way forward for all organizations, regardless of what they do.
I'm going to go back to the beginning where we started this podcast. We started the podcast by talking about one of the most insidious threats to an organization today, and that is social engineering, phishing, this risk of malicious emails targeting people to either download malware, ransomware, click URLs and enter credentials, pay invoices, etc. Where do you see the future of this kind of threat evolving? And in general, what kind of threats are you and your team thinking about for the next year, 2 years ahead?
Great question. Looking forward and looking across the world of social engineering, I'm hopeful in very odd ways, perhaps, and I'll explain that. I'm excited about the ongoing increases in abilities of products and security teams to catch up with, and in some cases, perhaps even get ahead of, ongoing evolution in attacker behavior using social engineering as a vector. And I think that we will continue to see a trend of the ongoing game of cat and mouse, of technological and process-based advancements on the defense side paired with evolution on the attacker side. And so it's I think we'll absolutely continue to see that type of engagement between defenders and adversaries under the umbrella of social engineering. I am also very excited about a future, and this is probably a multi-year away type of future, but if we are successful as an industry, and by an industry I mean both like on the practitioner side of security teams within an organization, and as the industry of security products that need to help in this space, I think success in email-based social engineering, account takeover, and so on, actually results in a shift of attacker behavior that we should be able to observe and measure. So I would be delighted if in a few years from now, the conversation that we're having is more of email security is still a big challenge and a huge need for an organization. But these social engineering threats that we face are still there, but much more manageable than they are for most organizations today. And that the conversation has shifted to, now how do we solve for the inevitable shift on the attacker side to communication mechanisms that are outside of just email? So how do we deal with things like SMS-based phishing and social engineering? How do we deal with voice calls? How do we deal with chat platform-based delivery of social engineering attacks? I will be happy if we are able to have that conversation in a couple of years, and very excited to start shifting into solving that problem space as well.
Josh, thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. We're going to include a link to the report in the show notes of this podcast, and you'll also be able to access it via the Tessian blog at tessian.com/blog. There's a lot for our listeners to learn from that. Do check it out. And if you read it, let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your feedback. Josh, we like to wrap up all of our interviews with some rapid fire questions to get to know the humans on the Human Layer Security podcast a little bit better. So what's the app that you can't live without?
Oh, I'm going to have to give you two answers. It's Google Maps because I can't find my way around anywhere anymore. And Signal. Signal's the way that I stay in touch with all of my friends, and that's just my social backbone.
I know what you mean about Google Maps. I've witnessed it in my own life. It's like when I go back to my hometown when, I used to drive when Google Maps didn't exist, and I need Google Maps to, get down to the grocery store or anything. I'm very dependent on it myself. What is your favorite thing to do on the weekend?
I try to turn off technology, spend time with my kids. I've got two younger children, and I'm in the peak experience of dad mode and playing with them over the weekend. So that's absolutely my favorite thing to do. I also like to get out into the garage, and I'm attempting to become a woodworker, which is a little bit of a emerging stereotype, I think, with IT and security folks these days. But I'll keep you posted on how that's going. So far, no success to report.
What's the current project?
There's that odd reality of, in order to build things, you have to build things that help you build things. So right now I'm building new stations for workbenches and tools, and I need to get that done before I get to the fun part.
Very cool. What is the best advice you've ever received?
Oh, that is a very tricky one. I'm going to actually go back and think about reference two things. And oddly enough, these actually are core corporate values from two organizations I've worked for. It's very odd to call that the best advice I've ever received, but I find myself thinking about these on almost a daily basis. One is from Duo, the concept of being kinder than necessary. And that's something where that's a value that I've really taken on myself, for myself and teams that I lead. And I try to live that every day. And so I've seen the value of that value of that core value from that organization firsthand. And the other one actually comes from Facebook. There's a core value there that nothing at Facebook is somebody else's problem. And that's something that I think has driven, a lot of progress in how teams work together and support each other. So I think, that's just one of those hallmark values that I think, any and all teams can really benefit from.
Josh, thank you so much.
And that just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. We'll be back with more human layer security insights in our next episode. But if you can't wait that long, you can visit our blog at tessian.com/blog, where you'll find lots of amazing content, advice, and tips. And if you enjoyed our show, please rate and review it on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.